Again, what we needed to do was allow the user to type in a lot of different student scores, and based on what they type in, we convert it to a letter grade. On top of that, we calculate the highest score, the max score, and the average score. And there was a couple methods you should have had in order to do that, and we'll write out those methods here. All right, so one of the first methods we needed was a return average score, or a return average of all the scores method, right? And for that method, it was public static double, because the average typically has a decimal within it, so we're going to return a double. Calculate average. And we want to pass in all of our scores. All right? And then we had something called double average equals 0, and then return average, right? So that's what we had. And I told you all to compute the average. So how do we do that? Well, of course, to compute the average, we first need to sum up all of our scores, right? We have to sum them all up and then divide by the total amount of scores, okay? So in order to sum them up, we must loop through all our scores. Int I equals 0. I is less than scores dot length. I plus plus. We have to loop through all of our scores in our array and just add whatever that score is to our sum. So at that point, we just do sum plus equal scores at index I. And again, I loops through the entire array. I will start at index 0, go to index 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, all the way up until the scores.length minus 1. And that's what we want. We want to go through each individual index and add that to our sum variable. Once we have our sum, right, outside of our loop, the next thing would be to just do average equals sum divided by scores.length. Remember, scores.length gets us the total number of scores, so 15, 16, 17 different scores. Our sum is all those scores added up, and then we divide by the total number of scores, which is scores.length. And that gets us our average. And so this method right here, return the average of all scores. This method right here returns the average. Okay? Any questions on that one? All right. Well, the next thing we need to do is create a method that returns the highest score, or the max score. We'll go back to here. Get the max score. We do public static int, because we're returning the max score, and we know all of our scores are going to be integers. Find max, and we pass in all of our scores so that we can loop through it. Then I had something called int max equals integer dot min value, and that's because each time we go through, if the number within our scores is greater than our current max, we want to replace the current max, okay? And if we, by starting our max at the smallest possible value, that means even if the first score within our array is negative 4,000, that's still going to be greater than integer.min value, the minimum possible value, which is negative, I think it was like 20 billion, negative 2 trillion, something like that. So now, in order to find the max, we need to loop through the entire array and compare it to our current max. If that index is greater than our current max, we set our max equal to that index. So for int I equals 0, I is less than scores.length again, I plus plus. And don't worry too much. You will have an opportunity, if you didn't get it submitted, you will have an opportunity to resubmit this for half credit, as always. Scores.length. And then we loop through each time we're checking to see if that current score or if that current index is greater than our current maximum number. If it is, we set our max equal to that number. So if scores at index I is greater than max, which is our current max, we set max equal to scores at index I. All right? Because, again, if scores at index I is greater than our current max, if that's true, that means that our current max is like a 5, and scores.I is 7. Right? So 7 is greater than our max, therefore set max equal to 7. Then go to the next one, check that. Let's say the next score is a 15. Is 15 greater than 7? Well, if that's true, set max equal to 15. Then if we go to the next score, let's say that next score is a 3. Is 3 greater than 15? Well, that would be false. Therefore, we're not going to set max equal to 3. It's still going to be 15. All right? So that way, at the end of this entire for loop, after we go through all of the indices in our array, we should have the max score, and so we just return max. Okay? Any questions on that one? Finding the max. All right, we'll go on to the next one then. The next one, create a method that converts the score into a grade. So this was probably the most challenging one because you need to use if statements. Convert score to grade. All right, you needed if statements in order to do this one correctly. So public static string, because we want to return one letter grade, convert score. And this one, we just want to take in one single score. For example, if I pass this method a 45, it should return an F. If I pass it a 95, it should return an A. And if you notice, I did change the directions a little bit from when you all did it. If you did it as the previous direction stated, that's fine as well. If you did it how I changed it, which is the most common grading scale, that works too. I'll grade you on both of those. I'm going to go off what I have here, which is anything greater than or equal to a 90 is an A. Anything greater than or equal to 80 is a B. In between 80 and 90. Anything between 70 and 80 is a C. Anything between 60 and 70 is a D. Everything else is an F. So I'm going to go with that one and write that out. So, convert score. We have string grade equals this right here. And now all we got to do is our if statements. And our if statements directly correspond with this right here. If score is greater than or equal to 90. If score is greater than or equal to 80. If 70, if 60, otherwise it's an F. Okay? And then with an if statement, it's pretty much the same language except you include parentheses. So if score greater than or equal to 90, grade equals A. Bam, that's our first one. Else if score greater than or equal to 80, grade equals a B. All right. So at this step, you may be asking, why didn't I say if score is greater than or equal to 80 and less than or equal to 90? All right. The reason being is why we use if and else if, right? So if this is true, grade equals 90. If it's not true, go to the next one. Then we check if score is greater than or equal to 80. So if our program ever gets to this next else if, that means that score has to be less than 90 because this one was false. if this one was true, it would go in here, set grade equal to A, and then skip all the rest of these. It would never check the else ifs. Versus if I had this right here, if I had two just regular if statements, it would check is score greater than or equal to 90. And let's say, for example, our current score right now, we pass in a 98, right? If we pass in a 98, that means it's check. If score is greater than or equal to 90. Yeah, that's true. Grade would be set equal to A because score is 98. Then it would still go to the next if statement and check if score is greater than or equal to 80. Well, that's true too. 98 is greater than 80. So it would set grade equal to B. That's not what we want. We want one of these to be true and to skip over all the rest. So in this same scenario, if I have this code instead, if the score is 98, that's greater than or equal to 90, grade would be set to A, and it would skip this else if. It would never go there, okay? So that's the importance of if and else ifs versus just regular ifs. If you just have ifs, it's going to check everything. If you have if else if, once one of those are true, it skips all the rest of them, all right? And by doing that, we know if this first if statement is false, that means that score has to be less than 90. Because if it was greater than or equal to 90, it would have went into this if statement and skipped these. That's why I don't have to include score greater than or equal to 80 and score less than or equal to 90. It's already implied by this if statement being false. Okay? Does that make sense? All right, well, I'm going to keep going. So that's how we do this right here, this logical statement right here. We can just continue that logic for all the rest of the scores. Else if score is greater than or equal to 70, grade equals C. Else if score is greater than or equal to 60, grade equals D. And then for everything else, grade equals F. All right. So again, if it's greater than or equal to 90, it's an A. Else if it's greater than or equal to 80, it's a B. Else if it's greater than or equal to 70, C. Else if greater than or equal to 60, it's a D. Everything else is an F. And then we just return grade. That returns whatever that converted score is as an A, B, C, D, or E, or F, I'm sorry. And then our last method was to create a method that loops through the array and prints student score and grades, the average score, and the highest score, similar to how it's displayed below in the sample run. All right. So far, any questions? Please speak up. I know this was a lot. This combined everything we've learned so far. So if you have questions, and I'm sure there are questions out there, please let me know. No questions? Sure? All right. All right, so our last method was display grades, and I gave you this method. So public static void display grades, or display scores, and we pass in our array of scores. All right, and it's a void because we're not returning anything. We're just going to display our scores. All right, so the first thing we did, we look back here. When we display our scores, we want to say student 0 or student whatever index we're at. Score is whatever their score is, and grade is their score converted into a letter grade. All right. So in order to do that, from what we can see here, it's looping through all of our scores, right? 0, 1, 2, 3. It's looping sequentially through all of our scores. So what should we do? We should also loop through our scores and print it out as we see it. So if we want to loop through, again, we do a for loop. Int I equals 0. I is less than scores dot length. I plus plus. And then we do a system dot out dot print line, right? Because we wanted to print on a new line each time. Score or student at index I, right? Because I is going to iterate through all of our different indices, and it's going to start from 0 all the way up to scores.length minus 1. Score is, then we add in or concatenate scores at index I for that student, right? Their index, say for example, I is 0. It's going to say student 0, score is, and then we get the score at index 0 that corresponds with that student. And grade is, lastly, we just need to concatenate. We call our convert score method, and we pass in whatever that student score is, which is our array at index I. That's that corresponding student score. So this whole line, let's say, for example, in our scores array, we pass in a 40 for the first student. Student 0 has a 40. This line would say student 0, score is, and then it would say scores at index I would be a 40, so it's going to say is 40, and grade is, then we call our method convert score, passing in a 40. So at this point, it's going to jump up here. Actually, let me do this for you so you can see my mouse. At this point, it's going to jump up here to our method, passing in a 40 for score, and it's going to check if score is greater than or equal to 90. No, 40 is less than 90. Greater than or equal to 80. 40 is less than 80. 40 is less than 70. 40 is less than 60. So it's going to go to an else. Grade would equal F. Then we return F. So this whole method down here would say F. So this whole line, student 0, score is 40, and grade is F. Let's do that, just to make it look a little bit better when it prints out. So it'd say student 0's score is 40, and grade is F. Okay? So that's what that line does, and it's going to print out each one of these students in that format. It's going to loop through and print it out in that exact same format for each student. Okay? And that's what we have there. Our last step, if we look at our directions, before I continue, questions on that at all? What I just did? All right. The next step would be the highest score and the average score. And for that, all we need to do is print out our highest score and average score. So system.out.println, the highest score is, and then all we have to do is call our method, find max, passing in our scores array. Same thing for our average, system.out.println, the average score is compute average, or calculate average, calculate average, passing in our scores array as well. All right. So our display scores method is finished. Right. This line, we're displaying student, let's use 0 for example, student 0's score is 40, and grade is convert score, passing in a score of 40. We come up here, it checks each one of those. 40 is not greater than any of these numbers, so it's going to go to our else. Grade equals F, and then return grade, which would be an F. Lastly, we system.print out the highest score is. We call our method, passing in our scores array. Same thing here, system.out.println, the average score is. We call our method, passing in our scores array. And all our methods up here will calculate the max, find the max, and calculate the average. Okay? All right, so the last and final step would be to allow user input so that they can type in the total number of students and the scores for each student. So, in our code up here, in our main, of course we need a scanner because we'll be reading in from the console equals new scanner system.in. Now we always need a scanner if we want to read from the console. Again, you can click over here or hit Control-Shift-I. Okay. And then we need to prompt the user and say system.out.print, enter the number of students. That prompts the user by printing to the console, enter the number of students. So then we want to read that in. Num students equals input.next int. Now we're reading in the next integer. Based on that integer, we want to create an array of that size, call it scores equals new int num students. Bam. So I just created an array called scores of size, however number of students the user inputted. And so, for example, if they put in a 5 right here, we would have an array of size 5 with indices 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4. All right. Next, we want to prompt the user to enter however number of scores into the program. Enter blank scores. So in order to print that out, system.out.print, enter, space, concatenate num students, because that's how many scores they said they want to enter, scores. All right. So now we've prompted the user to enter 4 scores, right? Enter 5 scores, enter 6 scores, and it's based on what they typed in up here, however many students they wanted to type in scores for. After that, let's read in our scores. So we want to create a for loop equals 0. I is less than num students. I plus plus. And so each time we loop through this, we want to set scores at index I equal to input.next int. We want to read another integer from the console. Scores at index I equals input.next int. And now we've read in our scores. All right. We read in our scores, one input at a time. Now from there, the last thing we need to do is just call our display scores method, passing in our scores array. And there we go. That was the full program. All right. Again, this method right here calculates the average. In order to do that, we have to sum up all our scores, which I'm doing here with the for loop. I'm summing up all our scores. Then I'm computing the average by saying sum divided by scores.length, which gives me the total number of scores. And I return the average. This method right here, it finds the maximum score. And I do that by looping through all of our scores and checking if the score at index I, if it's greater than our current max, set max equal to score at index I. Then I return the max. Next, I have a method that converts a score, a numerical score, into a letter grade. So if I pass in a 40 or a 50 or a 60, it's going to check all of these if statements and convert it to, or set grade equal to either A, B, C, D, or F, based on whatever that score is that's passed in, and then return that grade. Lastly, I have a display scores method, which prints out the student 0, 1, 2, 3, 4 over and over again. Score is, then I get that student score, and grade is, I convert their score, calling our method, and pass in that student score from our method, from our array. Lastly, I print out the highest score, calling our method, passing in our scores array, and I compute the average score, calling our method, passing in our scores array. All right. Up in the main, I have a scanner to read from the console. Then I prompt the user to enter the number of students, and I read in the num students equals input.nextInt. Then I create a scores array of size num students. Then I prompt the user to enter in however many students they said, scores. Then I read in those individual numbers right here with a loop. And then lastly, I call our display scores method, passing in this scores array up here. All right. So when I run this, I'm going to debug it so we can see line by line. This first line creates our scanner object. The next line prints to the console, enter the number of students. The next line will read the number of students. So if I put in a 5, now if we look at our variables over here, we see num students equals 5. That's what I typed in. So our next line creates a scores array of size 5. We look at our variables again, we see a scores array over here, and it's of size 5 with index 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4. Then our next line prints out enter 5 scores. Go to our output, enter 5 scores. Then we create a for loop that loops through 5 times and reads in scores. So the first time is going to read in the first score I type in, which I'm going to put at 89. Then it's going to loop through again, go to the top. It's going to read in the next score I type in, which would be a 90. And I can type it like this, just spaces. Hit enter. So now I read in the next score, and it's going to keep reading in scores 5 times until it reads in all of our scores. If we look at our variables, we now see that our scores array has been updated with those variables, with those values, 89, 90, 62, 42, 78. Our scores array was updated with all of those values. Then we call our display scores method. So let's jump into that method. It goes down here past our scores array, and if you notice, our variables change down here because within the scope of this method, we only have one variable, which is our scores array. We don't have num students, we don't have anything else. We just have our scores array, which it copies, pass by value, into this method, display scores. So we go to this for loop. This for loop is going to iterate through all of our scores and print out this whole line. So we jump over it, but I don't want to jump over this because it was just printed. I want to go into this method. So let's go into this method, not print line. Oh, it didn't go in. So let's see. And it didn't do it. So it didn't jump into the method like I wanted. Let's run this again. However, it did print out all of our student scores. It converted them. It computed the highest score and the average score. Let's run this again so I can show you it in the method. And I'm going to put a breakpoint right there instead. So again, it's going to run through, enter the number of students, 5, enter 5 scores, 89, 90, 78, 59, and 62. I I hit enter. It reads in all those scores. So right now, what it did is it went all the way down to this line. It went to convert score for the first student, and then it jumped. I put a breakpoint inside this method, so it stops right here in this method. So the first score that it passed, I expect it to be 89. So let's look at our variable. Score equals 89. Yes, that's what was passed to this method the first time this loop iterates. So score 0 equals 89. So we go through this. Is 89 greater than or equal to 90? No. However, it is greater than or equal to 80. 89 is greater than or equal to 80. So grade equals B. It skips all the rest, returns grade, prints it out. So student 0 score is 89 and grade is B. We called this method. We go to the second student whose score is a 90. So we'd expect them to have an A. We jump back in here. Score is 90. Is that greater than or equal to 90? Yes, it is. Grade equals A. Skip the rest. Return A. Print it out. So you see it printed out score 1. Student 1's score is 90 and grade is A. Student 2's grade is a 78, so I expect them to have a C. Not greater than or equal to 90. It's not greater than or equal to 80. However, it is greater than or equal to 70. So their grade is a C. Jump out. Print out their score. And you see student 2's score is 78 and grade is C. Student 3's score is a 59, so I'd expect them to have an F. We jump in. It's not greater than or equal to 90. It's not greater than or equal to 80, 70, 60. So it's an F. Return grade. Print that out. And you see student 3 scores a 59. And lastly, student 4 scores a 62, so they should have a D. Go to our if statements. It's D, yep. Return grade, print that out, and we're done with our loop. And we just print out all of our students' scores right here. The last thing is to go to our find max and our calculate average methods. Those would find our max, which is 90, and it calculates our average, which is 75.6, and then our program ends.